First of all, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And also, I'm very thankful to the organizing committee for inviting me to be the part of this national conference. Today, we are going to have a glance on role of statistics in bioequivalence studies. Before we discuss about the statistical methods in bioequivalence studies, let me define what is bioequivalence. Dr. Prabhakar has given already a small introduction, but we'll discuss this in a little more detail. To understand bioequivalence studies, first we have to understand bioavailability. Bioavailability means the rate and extent to which the active drug substance is absorbed from a pharmaceutical form and becomes available at the site of action. Why? Why we are interested in that? If we are taking 500 mg paracetamol, it's going into our system, in our body to give the therapeutic effect. But actually it doesn't happen. What happens, whatever we eat, a fraction of it is only absorbed into the system, and that's why our interest is to know the bioavailability. That means we want to know at what rate and at what extent the drug is available to the body to give the therapeutic effect. And very important here is available at the site of action. Site of action may be stomach, neck, anywhere in the body. So can we get the data from there? No. We cannot collect the data from there. So what we do? What have been observed by the pharmacologists and the scientists, that the rate and extent of absorption of the drug at the site of action can be mimicked by the rate and extent of absorption of the drug in the blood circulation. So how do we conduct bioavailability studies? We give drug to the subjects, take blood samples at various time points from the subjects. These time points are decided based on the pharmacokinetic profile of the drug, collect the blood samples, then we measure the concentrations in those samples, and we plot those concentrations versus time, and this will be like this. Initially you can see it is increasing because the whole drug is in the body. It is being absorbed from that pharmaceutical formulation, and absorption is dominating. Even though absorption and elimination are happening together, but in the beginning absorption is dominating, and that's why we are seeing this increasing trend. At a particular position, both of them are same. Absorption and elimination are same, and then we see the prototype of figure, and then elimination starts dominating and we get the concentration decreasing. Now here this Cmax, which is the maximum concentration, and this is Tmax, time to achieve maximum concentration. These are the measures of rate of absorption, and area under this curve is the extent of absorption. So basically this is not the whole pharmacokinetics. These are only the 3 parameters of pharmacokinetics, but otherwise pharmacokinetics itself is a very huge subject. But these parameters are used in the evaluation of bioequivalence, because in bioequivalence, just let me go to the next slide. Okay, now we'll see at the definition of bioequivalence. Bioavailability is for one formulation. For bioequivalence, as the word says, bioequivalence, that means biologically equivalent. When we say equivalence, that means something is equivalent to other. That means bioequivalence is defined between the two formulations, and the two formulations are said to be bioequivalent if the rate and extent of absorption of one formulation do not show a significant difference from the rate and extent of absorption of the other formulation when administered at the same molar dose of the therapeutic ingredient under similar experimental conditions. So if you look here, what we are talking about? Do not show a significant difference between the rate and extent of absorption. That means bioequivalence is nothing but the comparative bioavailability studies. Many a times our protocol writing team come to me and ask, the sponsor is asking to write comparative bioavailability studies instead of bioequivalence study. Then I said, this is nothing, it's the same. You say it is bioequivalence study or you can call it comparative bioavailability study. Important here is that they should not have a significant difference when everything is under similar experimental condition. That is also very, very important. When we expect that the two formulations are bioequivalent, or when we think that obviously when we are making a formulation similar to some other formulation, we will expect that both are similar. And when we expect that both are similar, then the blood concentration time profile of both the formulation should be almost similar. We can say overlapping. So usually doesn't happen, but they are very similar when the products are bioequivalent. Now, question is, why do we do bioequivalence studies? What is the requirement? What has been again observed in research, if the products are bioequivalent, that means if they have similar blood plasma concentration time profile, they give the similar therapeutic effect. Okay, we got it. Concentration profile is same, so therapeutic effect will also be same. So what? So benefit is, if they are bioequivalent, we do not have to conduct the clinical trials in patient as is done for the innovator products. Innovator means the first formulation of if there is a new drug and we prepare the formulation of that drug first time, then we have to do lot of preclinical and clinical research. But that is not required if we are making another formulation which is bioequivalent to the first formulation. We do not have to conduct the whole preclinical and clinical for the second formulation. Rather, the data which have been generated for the first formulation can be extrapolated for the second formulation. So what is the benefit? We are saving time, money, energy, and that will reflect in the cost of the second formulation, and that will be useful for the consumers as well as the government. Now, situations when bioequivalence studies are needed. One very common situation which I think all of us know, generic and innovator. Innovator, as I said, the first formulation of any new drug, that is known as the innovator product. What happens? The innovator product has the exclusivity for some period of time. That means during that period, no other company can make the same drug. But once that patent period is over, other companies also can manufacture the product and sell in the market. So that is the situation where bioequivalence studies are conducted. We all know about that. But other than this, there are situations where we have to conduct the bioequivalence studies. Sometimes even with the innovator product, throughout the research process, that means preclinical or clinical, we may be having a particular type of formulation, but at the time of marketing, there may be a very small change, maybe some practical reasons we have to make. At that time also, the company has to perform a bioequivalence study between the to be marketed formulation and the formulation which have been used throughout the research process, or formulations are in the market, but some manufacturing changes are there, then also one has to conduct the bioequivalence studies. So these are the situations when bioequivalence studies are required. Now we know why bioequivalence studies are done and when bioequivalence studies are required. Now next is how to conduct a bioequivalence study. So just we'll again have a look on a definition. Similar type of definition, this is actually I think from US FDA. Bioequivalence is defined as the absence of a significant difference in the rate and extent to which the active ingredient or active moiety in pharmaceutical equivalents or pharmaceutical alternatives becomes available at the site of drug action when administered at the same molar dose and under similar conditions, which we have already seen in the last definition. But here one more thing is in an appropriately designed study. That means we cannot do one bioavailability study, another bioavailability study and say, okay, products are bioequivalent if rate and there is no difference in rate and extent. Important is that the study should be conducted in appropriately designed study. Now, when we say appropriately designed study, what it means? Actually, bioequivalence involves three expertise. One, clinical, second, bioanalytical, third, statistics. We are going to focus today only the statistical part, but when we say the design, it is from all the aspects. That means how to design the pharmacokinetic points. As Prabhakar mentioned, like as a statistician, you should know the kinetics part of the drug also. But actually this work is of the pharmacokinetist, but during the process of whole our work, we should learn pharmacokinetic part of the drug also so that we can be involved. Usually we are involved in the industry. When we said properly designed, even the bioanalytical is there. How that those are involved in the properly designed? Whatever bioanalytical method they are having, that should be sensitive enough to measure the small concentrations also. You cannot go with any method. Nowadays they say that your method should have a capability to measure 1/10 of the Cmax at least. Like usually what we do in our company at Synchron, we go up to 1/20th of the Cmax. Our method is so sensitive that we can measure 1/20th of the Cmax also in the biological fluid. So as I said, we are going to discuss only the statistical part. So next comes standard statistical designs in bioequivalence. Again, I think we have listened the names of the design, two-way crossover. I think statisticians, they all know two-way crossover, but I will just mention for others who do not know. Crossover means the same subject will receive both the treatments. I think for the convenience, we'll call one as test and one as reference. Reference is the one which is the first one, and test is the one which is going to be prepared similar to the reference. So both the treatments, test and reference, are given to the same subjects at two different occasions. These two occasions are usually known as the two periods in bioequivalence studies. And these two periods are wide apart, which they call that they have a washout period between them. Why? Because if there is no washout period and we give one drug and we give another drug, what may happen that the concentration of first period will interfere with the concentration of second period drug. So we have to have two periods with a sufficient washout period. Test is given on first occasion, reference is given on the second occasion, but it's not like that. If there are 12 subjects, 50% of them will receive test first and reference second, and 50% of them will receive reference first and test second time. That means this is the important part of the design. You cannot say, okay, it's a crossover, we'll give all the subjects test first and all the subject reference because it's a crossover. But no, it has to be designed so that if there is any effect because of the sequence of the treatment, that is nullified. So two-way crossover design is the standard design, mostly recommended design in bioequivalence studies. But sometimes what happens? A drug has a long half-life. Because washout depends on the half-life, and if drug has a very long half-life, what may happen? That the two periods are far, far apart. So no problem, let it be. No, there is a problem. If periods are far, far apart, subjects may drop out. They may not turn up. So we have to go for the parallel design, or sometimes there may be some other issues if bioequivalence studies are conducted in patients. For some molecules like cancer, we conduct the study in patient. In those cases, or some other situations also where condition of the patient is changing, we cannot use crossover design, we have to use parallel group design. Why crossover is recommended over the parallel? Because in crossover, each subject acts as its own control, because he is getting test and reference both. So, control is in the same subject. And the second, the company's point of view, number of subjects required in crossover are almost 50% than the number of subjects required in the parallel group design. Then there are other designs like replicate design and two-stage or sequential design. We will discuss later on in the presentation. I think this is the thing which everybody talked about, number of subjects. And as a statistician, we all feel this thing. People come to us like we are a magician. They ask us, give us a number within our budget. But actually we do not, we are the like servant of everything. We don't have any power. We cannot give any number. The number is actually dependent on, in bioequivalence studies, the power of the study. Again, power is the requirement of the manufacturer, because they don't want their equivalent product to be declared as bio-inequivalent. So power, which is again the sponsors or company's number, intra-subject variability or inter-subject variability. If it is a crossover design, intra-subject variability is required for sample size calculation. If it is a parallel group design, inter-subject variability is required for the sample size calculation. Then deviation of test product from the reference product. Again, it is the number from the company. They know how they have prepared the formulation, they know how different their formulation is from the reference. Then significance level, and also very important, we should all remember acceptable bioequivalence limits. Mostly for bioequivalence limits are 80 to 125, but we will see later on in the presentation. But for some other type of molecules, the acceptance limit is not 80 to 125, rather than something else. So when you are calculating sample size, keep in mind this also in calculation. So okay, we have designed the study by using a particular design. We have calculated the sample size, and then we conducted the study, data is collected, and then we start analyzing the data. I think again Prabhakar mentioned very correctly, in 70s, the statisticians were involved. Once the data is collected, people used to go to them and ask, analyze my data. In 90s, situation has changed, and in 2000, it has changed totally. So if you look at the articles published in 70s, 80s, beginning of 90s of bioequivalence studies, what you will see, the data was analyzed using analysis of variance. In analysis of variance, we all know, as a statistician, at least we know, others, we usually test whether mu t is equal to mu, whether there is equality versus alternative hypothesis, whether there is no equality, right? Mu t or mu r here for bioequivalence purposes are Cmax or area under the curve or AUC. So that means in ANOVA what we are testing, that formulations are bioequivalent is the null hypothesis, and formulations are not bioequivalent is the alternative hypothesis. But people later on realized that the formulations which actually should be bioequivalent are shown as bio-inequivalent. So that's not acceptable, because lot of efforts and money is involved. So what biostatistician looked at the definitions by the US FDA, what it says, products whose rate and extent of absorption differ by 20% or less are generally bioequivalent. That means pharmacologically, if there is a 20% difference in the rate of absorption or extent of absorption, the formulations are bioequivalent. That means the difference between test and reference Cmax can be minus 0.2, 20% of the reference on both the sides. It can be less, it can be 20% more. So actually, in bioequivalence, equivalence word doesn't mean equality. What it says, 20% difference is fine with us. So when this came to the statistician, they again went back and analyzed the data. And I think Westlake, he was working with US FDA, and he actually gave a series of tests, and this one is the final one which is accepted, which has all the characteristics which is required for a statistical test. What he has suggested, that 90% confidence interval for difference. If you are working on Cmax, so difference in Cmax. And this, I think, formula for the statistician is a very routine thing. For non-statistician also it is very simple thing. You can go and see, as suggested by Bolton, a very good book written for, I feel, for the statistician who are not aware of the biological things. They have given very nicely all the examples. So this formula is, this is a classical 90% confidence interval, nothing very special. And if confidence limits of obtained by this are within this numbers, we say the formulations are bioequivalent. And instead of difference, if we take the ratio, instead of mu t minus mu r, if we take mu t upon mu r, these limits are 80 to 120. Again, you must be surprising that why it is 80 to 120. We don't know it is 80 to 120, we know 80 to 125. Why? Anybody's answer? We'll see in the next slide. Okay, before we go into that, or okay, let me go first here. Actually, when Westlake was working on the 90% confidence interval approach, at the same time, Shorman, another statistician, was working on the testing of hypothesis approach. So as Nirali mentioned, the hypotheses are not always of equality or non-equality. It can be one-sided like this. An interesting thing in this thing is, you see, in ANOVA, null hypothesis was products are bioequivalent, alternative was products are bio-inequivalent, right? Null was equivalent, very important. Here, if you see here, the difference is less than the lower limit and difference is more than the lower limit. That means now null hypothesis says bio-inequivalence rather than bio-equivalence, and alternative are mu t minus mu r is greater than the lower limit, mu t minus mu r is less than the upper limit. That means now the role has reversed. The null hypothesis is bio-inequivalence and alternative hypothesis is of bio-equivalence. And what he suggested, if these two tests say that reject the null hypothesis, products are bio-equivalent, because null hypothesis is of inequivalence. If those are rejected, means products are bio-equivalent. Now, either you do this method or apply 90% confidence interval. Both will give same results. I am saying this because many a times, many a company in our organization asks, give us both the things. Not required. Why unnecessary burden us, burden regulatory? Give only what is required. So as I said, the role of null and alternative has changed. Equivalent, inequivalent, inequivalent, equivalent. Surprisingly, because of that, what happened? When ANOVA was the test of choice, level of significance is the manufacturer's risk and consumer's risk was 1 minus power. And at that time, if you look at the regulatory guidelines, regulations say that you should conduct the analysis of variance at 5% level of significance with at least 80% power. Why? Consumer risk is dependent on power. Suppose power is 60%, that means consumer's risk is 40%, not acceptable from the regulatory point of view, because the regulatory is more concerned for the consumers. Now the current situation is consumer risk is level of significance and manufacturer's risk is 1 minus power. And that is the reason now regulatory doesn't ask the power. Again, I am seeing many a times sponsor ask us to give us the power. We give, but that's not required because now the risk is of the manufacturers. So regulations are not worried for that. And consumer's risk is the level of significance which is fixed. Another thing, initially when all these tests were developed, started using, the people were analyzing the data on the original scale. But again, we are not going into the detail. There are various statistical loopholes in the test. So statisticians were working how to resolve those loopholes, and then they came to know that instead of analyzing the data on original scale, we should analyze the data on logarithmic scale. That means before analyzing the data, log transform the data. Why reason? Reason is actually all the statistical tests which we have talked about, they assume that the data has a normal distribution. But CMAX and AUC do not have normal distribution. Instead, they have log normal distribution, and that is the reason log transformation was suggested. So nowadays, when we analyze the data, first we log transform and then we do the analysis. Now, the question was why 80-120 is now changed to 80-125. When data was analyzed on the original scale, because that means before log transformation, the power of the test was maximum when mu t is equal to mu r, which is fine because when mu t upon mu r is 1, the power is also maximum. That is the desired property of a statistical test. When we have transformed, when it was suggested that do the analysis after log transformation, what has happened? Now power was maximum when mu t upon mu r is equal to 0.98, which is not a desired property for any statistical test. A test should have a maximum power when this ratio is 1. So how to make that? They just, instead of 80-120, they say 80-125. Now do this exercise. If you take ln of 0.8 and if you take ln of 1.25, it is same. 0.223, one is minus 0.223, another is 0.223. So that means after logarithmic transformation, 80-120 was not symmetric. It was symmetric when it was 80-1.25. That is the reason on logarithmic data, these limits are changed now. Instead of 80-120, it is 80-125. Sometimes we get data which is not of CMAX or AUC something else which has a normal distribution. That means we are not going to perform logarithmic transformation. In that case, limits are 80-120. Again, logarithmic 80-125. With raw data, it is 80-120. So that is the reason we have changed limits from 80-120 to 80-125. Now this is just a slide summarizing whatever we have discussed. What we do, we first log transform the data, calculate the 90% confidence interval, and then we again back calculate. That means we take the exponential of the values, and then whatever values we get, those values should be between 80-125. And whatever we have discussed in not in detail. If you really want to have a look, there is a paper where you can get all those things what we have discussed. If you want to know more in detail why the things have happened, this is given in this paper. When we apply statistical effects in model, what effect should be there if it is a crossover study? Usually we all use some softwares, right? So we have to have sequence effect, subject within sequence effect, formulation effect, period effect, residual effect for a crossover design. But if it is a parallel group design, we should have subject effect, formulation effect and residual effect in the model, and then we should analyze the data. Sometimes what happens, the group is large, suppose 80 subject, but our clinical site is not able to accommodate all the 80 subjects. What we do? We do the study in groups. Is it possible? Yes, it is possible. Only thing is we have to take care that subjects are dosed at the same clinical site, subjects are enrolled from the same enrollment pool, subjects have similar demographics, and subjects are randomly assigned to treatment groups. If these conditions are satisfied, we can have the study in groups, and then what precaution we should take as a statistician? We should incorporate group into the model. We have discussed only 5 factors in the two-way crossover, but if the study is conducted in group, the group will be included and the model will be little complicated. Does not matter because it is going to be done by computer. Only thing is we have to fit this model. And the important thing here to remember, when you are using this model and group into treatment effect is significant, then what? If group into treatment effect is significant, then we cannot club the two groups. We have to analyze both the groups separately. If it is insignificant, fair enough, what we can do, we drop this term from the model and analyze the data and calculate 90% confidence interval. I think there was a question, if we do not know interest or the parameters which especially the variability, how to design, how to get sample size. Actually, for those situations, in general, if possible, try to get the data, but there is a chance that we are not able to get the data, then sequential design can be used. In sequential design, the problem is number of subjects required are 20% more than the usual crossover design. But if there is no other option, there is another option is of doing a pilot study. If feasible, if sponsor is ready or our company is ready to do, because that will take a little more time. First we have to conduct pilot, get the data, information, design the pivotal study. But if they do not want, then we can go for the sequential, but the only sequential is, only thing what we have to take care, adjust level of significance for first stage data analysis as interim analysis, as we do in the clinical trial. If we are doing interim analysis, we have to pay in the significance level. So that same thing it has to be done in the bioequivalence studies. And there is a very good paper by Potwin et al. You can go, this is freely available on the net, you can go through. Here they have given 3 approaches, one which is very commonly used and even I follow in my studies if I have to apply sequential design. Here what we do, based on the structure, similarity with some other molecule, we decide some number, okay, we will do a study in this number, conduct the study, and if power is greater than 80% of that small study, then even if it fails or pass, stop the study, whatever is there. But if power is less than 80% at that stage, then we evaluate the bioequivalence at 94.12 instead of 90%. This is the reason we have to have 20% more subjects in this study. And then if power is less than 80%, bioequivalence criteria is met, no problem. If bioequivalence criteria is not met, then based on the results, we calculate the sample size and the additional number of subjects can be done in the second stage, and then we club both the stage data and analyze. Okay, very interesting. Everything was decided, 90% confidence interval, logarithmic transformation, 80 to 125. But still, what was scientists observing? that even if the products are bioequivalent, the studies are not saying so. Clinically, they are saying that they are equivalent, there is no problem, but still there was a problem. They observed that some drugs are highly variable. The sample size required for them is very, very high, very unpractical, cannot be conducted. What to do? This is one. Second, what pharmacologists or clinicians observed, for those drugs which are highly variable, the difference more than 20% also gives the same results. So that means what we have done till now, 20% difference, the acceptable one, but for highly variable drugs, the therapeutic window is wider. So 20% difference is not the right thing, it should be more, wider. So there are 2-3 approaches. One is just simply say instead of 80 to 125, we will go with 70 to 143. Another is, a lot of statisticians have worked on that. The one approach is that they have scaled the bioequivalence criteria using the reference product bioavailability. How to get reference product bioavailability? What we get in the simple two-way crossover? We get intra-subject variability, but actually that is not the actual intra-subject variability, that is the combination of many factors. To actually get the intra-subject variability, what we have to do? We have to conduct a replicate design. What is a replicate design? Replicate design, instead of two-way crossover, they are either three-way or four-way. In three-way, we give reference twice and test once. In four-way, we give reference twice and test also twice. So in the first part of first type of replicate design, we get the intra-subject variability of the reference. In the second type of design, we get the intra-subject variability of the reference as well as intra-subject variability of the test. But regulatory say that scale it to reference variability, so both the designs are acceptable, and then there is a formula given for this. This is a regulatory constant, it is 0.293 I think for the European guidelines, may be different depending on the regulations, and this is the intra-subject variability of the reference product which we will get from the reference replicate or fully replicate. But what they say, scale the reference, scale the bioequivalence criteria, but that is applicable only for the 90% confidence interval. For the point estimate, we have to have the limits again at 80 to 125. This is one approach. Second is, they say do scaled average bioequivalence, that means the 95% upper confidence bound for this have to be calculated. This everything is given in US FDA's progesterone guidelines. Progesterone is a highly variable drug. So US FDA has given the all these things in these guidelines, you can get it. Only important thing is, even if you use this method or you use the previous method, the conclusion will be same. But as usual, I always say US FDA complicates the life always. They do not want the simple things, whereas Europeans give us the life simple. These are the two publications which you can go through. They have given a very kind of say they have fully described the methods which we have discussed just now. So if you have interest, you can go through these two articles. Again, they are available on the net free. Another problem. I think life is full of problems. When we solve one problem, another comes. What has been observed? That there are few drugs which have been shown that they are bioequivalent, but actually but subjects are switching from one to another, they were not getting the similar type of effect. Drugs, warfarin, digoxin, levothyroxine. Why? Because these are the drugs where therapeutic window is very narrow. When we say therapeutic window is very narrow, it means the concentrations should be in a narrower area, then only they will give the therapeutic effect. Otherwise, either they will be toxic or they will not give any effect. Again, what to do with these drugs? Because using the bioequivalence approach, which we have seen earlier till now, they are saying inequivalent product also equivalent. I mean, the problem is totally reverse. What we have in the highly variable, it is totally reverse in the NTR drugs. But because we have dealt the one situation, second was easier. So solution for this came very quickly. What they say, I mean, for NTD showing bioequivalence is not easy. One unscaled average bioequivalence, the routine 80 to 125, simple. That we have to perform for NTR drugs, no question on that. At the same time, perform scaled average bioequivalence, same as in the highly variable drug. Can you see any difference? If I show you, this is for NTR and this is for highly variable. Can you see any difference? Can anybody? Sorry? Sigma W0 constant. Right. When you say upper limit, that means you mean to say this? Yes, that is the main difference. Here you see 1.25 and so that is the approach is same, only these two numbers have changed. And also we have, like in highly variable, we just have to calculate 90% confidence, 90% upper bound plus ratio. Whereas in narrow therapeutic drugs, we have to have simple unscaled average bioequivalence, scaled average bioequivalence, and also in addition to these two, calculate the 90% confidence interval of the ratio of the within subject standard deviation of test product or reference product. So that means one more difference, for highly variable drugs, two types of replicate, 3-way or 4-way. For NTR drugs only 4-way, because we have to have within subject of test as well as within subject of a reference. Again, you just search this warfarin US FDA recommendation, you will get the guidelines, and they have given the whole procedure. They have given the SAS program for the same. Again, this is the articles. These are the articles where they have defined the method which we have just saw. So what we have seen, lot of progress in last 40 years from 70 actually I should say last 50 years from 70s to now 2020 roughly. And this progress, the contributions of statisticians is significant. And we cannot assume that this process of progress is yet complete. There may be other situations which we have not thought of may come, and that, as everybody has said, is only possible if both of us, that means as a statistician we, as a pharmacologist, as a clinicians, the other side, they both understand each other's problem. As you can see, initially the scientist, the clinical scientist went to statistician, okay, we have bioequivalence data, analyze it. They have analyzed, because whenever anybody comes to us to compare two data, what we do? To t-test, ANOVA. That's what they have done, because they have not understood, they were not involved. But once they were involved, they came to know, no, it's not like that, it is something different. So what we actually need to understand each other's language, to understand each other's subject, and then only there will be such type of progress is possible. So this is an attempt to explain the statistics for non-statistician, especially the examples given in this book are from the pharmaceutical science. So, it's a very basic book. Statisticians may not enjoy that much, but the people who are not from the statistics background, they may enjoy this book because all the examples are either from the pharmaceutical science or maybe cognosy, bioequivalence, clinical trial, anything. So, you can have a look. Okay, with this, thank you all for the patience listening.